All right, guys, thank you for joining us for the last section of our presentation over the 5W's of dyslexia. If you're interested in finding any of the previous ones, go to dyslexiaondemand.com. All four previous are already posted, but we are currently at our last W. Where? Where are we going if we don't fix this problem? In this part, I'm going to touch on fixing the literacy crisis as a whole, since you now understand why it all is equally important to our children with dyslexia. I'm going to give you some dyslexia specific sites and tips and resources for advocates and parents also in this part. All right, so this is my favorite meme for dyslexia. And I had to share it with this audience. And in fact, I think this is my last and final meme since they've all been integrated into the other four parts. But sadly, parents and advocates have to take this approach with our schools, despite the amount of research that's out there already. So this is a big synthesis of everything in my presentation, a visual summary of everything that needs to change to fix the system. This is a fusion of literacy and dyslexia, in fact. So this impacts both our kids in gen ed and those with dyslexia. And of course, it all starts with awareness, which, believe it or not, we still do not have enough of. Districts need to be willing to adopt a growth mindset and realize that the problem won't get fixed by just repeating the same thing. Change is scary, and it is going to require a decision to train our staff in structured literacy and hire some expert certified dyslexia specialists for their campus. And to complement that, they're also going to need to purchase curriculum that supports structured literacy. But what all leads to that? Well, funding, of course. Oftentimes it means shifting funds from that new stadium to literacy, maybe writing grants, having PTOs raise money. I've seen all these things happen because we really just can't rely on the states to prioritize it. College level teacher training is going to need to start to incorporate structured literacy instruction into their coursework requirements. And we're all going to need to start using those quality universal screeners and using data to help drive our instruction, both gen ed and intervention, but especially when it comes to intervention. And all is not lost, because I am starting to see the shift. Some states more than others, and some districts more than others, and many are still in the dark ages. Not only does the state need to force or lead the charge, but there is so much more movement and change when administration cares and buys in. Teachers have no power, because it all needs to come from the top. And often it feels like a good old boy club. I'm in a rural good old boy district in Texas, and it's like they're ignoring everything that the state is providing because that's not the way that they've always done it. Here's a quick overview of what happens when we make changes. Mississippi was the first state to implement widespread changes. They needed it, being that they had very low proficiency rates. But starting in 2013, they passed a law to implement only evidence-based reading instruction, which by itself is a great step, but it's just not enough. Then the 2015 Governor's Task Force followed, where the state implemented changes to the early literacy curriculum in 15 public and private educator preparation programs across Mississippi. And this was all based in structured literacy. Now, remember, this is just to pre-service teachers. And with that simple change, fourth grade proficiency levels went up 5 full points in only 2 years. Some people call this the Mississippi miracle, even though it didn't just happen, it was made. Of course, Mississippi had room to growth, but they started looking into proper educator training and evidence-based reading instruction. And as of 2019, Mississippi had moved from 49th to 29th in the nation in literacy. It was so successful that they ended up coining a term in the literacy industry called the Mississippi model. The good news is that many states are trying to replicate what Mississippi has done. If Delaware approves their legislation, it will be 70% of them requiring evidence-based reading instruction as their standard in the classroom. But this is all much harder than it sounds since we need to teach our teachers the components of structured literacy. Requiring evidence-based curriculum is a great step, but it won't be as impactful until the teachers truly understand what is in the teacher's manual. To give you a snapshot of this, Texas is implementing reading academies that existing teachers have to attend over the next 3 years, learning all the ins and outs of literacy, of structured literacy. We're about halfway into that 3-year window. And they're 11 months long, and they are being faced with a lot of pushback, as a lot of teachers are not happy about this. But this is a marathon, not a sprint. But don't be fooled that we're fixed. Don't think that the switch to evidence-based reading instruction is going to happen overnight. I have 4 children in elementary school, and even though the Texas Ledge passed this in 2021, all my kids are still using that 3Qing and big box curriculum. They can force these teachers to study structured literacy, but if they don't support them with structured literacy curriculum versus that old balanced literacy that they've had for a long time, it really defeats the purpose. And I'm also getting this from a lot of conversations with teachers who are having to go to these reading academies, but then they come back into their classroom and their hands are tied. So since we're in Georgia, I thought I would share this article that states are starting to catch on to the momentous, top-down changes that need to be made. And Georgia wasn't even on the previous slide, so it's catching on slower in some states than others. But here's proof that implementation of high quality certified interventionists makes a huge difference. I met this woman named Dina Weems, a principal at an elementary school in Arkansas, and she had huge issues because 30% of her students in that school were in tier 3. So this is obviously a tier 1 problem. She had 9 of her 11 teachers trained to become CALTs. And this hugely improved classroom instruction and solved her structured literacy implementation problem. So of course, she's not giving therapy. They're not giving therapy to everyone, but they fully understand the concepts of structured literacy and how to implement that in their classroom. Of course, all the students who are identified with dyslexia, she got them all into, take flight therapy using CALTs, and look what happened. Her reading proficiency rates increased 19% in 3 years. Her school report card rating increased 3.26 points last year alone. So beware of the illusion of compliance. As we pass more and more legislation and districts catch on, be careful that they don't just start to check boxes for show that aren't actually effective. This is happening in Texas, so I want to discuss it. Naturally, parents trust schools because they're giving the illusion of compliance in these situations. They have a dyslexia program, but it happens to be watered down and not executed by someone trained in dyslexia. They are giving dyslexia time on those IEPs, but they're not giving instructional minutes that align with fidelity standards of evidence-based programs. They're addressing dyslexia, but no evidence-based dyslexia specific program, and simply lumping all the kids into the resource room with everyone else giving them more of what didn't work in the classroom. They're providing accommodations, but they're not placing stringent consequences for not executing them in the classroom. It's time for them to do it right and not just give parents the illusion of compliance. It's not about just getting a new curriculum. It's not just laws. It's lots of these little pieces that have to come together to make the change. And it's about new policies that support the teachers. A lot of the info is placing pressures on the school. The new information is placing pressures on the school to make changes. Lots of laws get put on the books and they're never followed. The laws on the books are the easier part. We can screen these kids, but then what? We can pass these laws, but what's next? Is the law actually solving the problem that it's intended to address? And really, everyone has to keep watch. Good core instruction will help to identify the kids who need help. And advice to administrators, you need that admin buy-in. There's no successful efforts if the admin isn't on board. The superintendent, the literacy coaches, the directors, they all have to buy into this whole new change. This issue means enough to enough people that we hope that it doesn't just go away. This just really cannot be the next shiny thing. What about 2 years from now, after science of reading is kind of worn out, or it's not that big thing in the media? This actually matters to the core of so many people, and we need more people willing to go to bat for them. We need to keep that momentum going. And of course, we need more of this in higher ed. So I'm going to now show you a couple tools that you can use when, in the fight with your kids, for educational advocates, for parents, everything. This shows you an interactive map where you can look up your specific area to find out the average reading levels per that NAEP data. If you want to understand more about your state's dyslexia-specific legislation, check out the National Center for Improving Literacy. Also, Google on your own whether or not your state has a dyslexia handbook, which I'm going to talk more about in a second. Finally, Dyslexia.com has a lot of dyslexia-specific legislation by state, and it's a great site that really does seem to stay pretty current. IDA also has an interactive map for legislation and bills that have been attempted related to dyslexia. Now let's talk about dyslexia handbooks. What they are is the state-specific guidelines and guidance on how we handle kids with dyslexia. And what they expect, what the state expects. Currently, 40% of our states have them, but they vary significantly. Anything from some guidance on their state's education agency website, right? Just a couple pages on that website, to Texas, who has an 86-page long document that's revised regularly. So don't be too impressed if your state is listed here. They come in all state shapes and sizes, but it is the right step. So I always recommend that you know about these and look for these. I strongly suggest you look yours up. And Dyslexia, the site I just talked about, has a lot of links to all of them. So we should call this the Texas model, like how Mississippi has a model related to their literacy. But instead, it needs to be the Texas model for the dyslexia handbook. I'm pretty sure Texas was the first state with a handbook all the way back to, I think, 1985. And it definitely is something other states should model theirs off. It's full of citations to excellent research for all of your purposes. So it's in our bank of downloads. They also update it regularly. It's currently in the revision process for a 2024 update, and they even have specific guidance for the state's expectations on how to intervene for students with dysgraphia. So it's very comprehensive. Barbara Bush always had a huge platform for literacy, and the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy also has a lot of great research on their site to help reinforce arguments. So let's look quickly at the economic impact of not making the change, since we know low reading rates in schools translate to much greater consequences in adulthood and to our society. If all adults in our country were able to move up to the equivalent of just a 6th grade reading level, the national economic benefit would be $2.2 trillion annually. Here's some state-specific figures that I could find. We would like to think that California would be super progressive and have dyslexia and literacy figured out, but that really wouldn't be further from the truth, as I'm sure a lot of people can attest to. But the consequence to California annually was $12 billion in 2022 alone, and it's estimated to cost the state $1 trillion over the next 60 years. 1 in 6 in Georgia have low literacy skills. The researchers further found that these adults cost Georgia about $1.26 billion a year, with most of that, 818 million, paying for folks in prison. And here's some more detail to that 1.26 billion per year broken down. We're looking at that is broken down by public assistant cost, prison costs, the cost of unemployment and uninsured costs. And you had to know I was headed to the prison system. This is an awesome article about the impact of ignoring dyslexia and reading disabilities in the criminal justice system. And here's a statistic that was pulled from that paper. The prison population has an almost 50% rate of dyslexia. Now, this is from Texas prisons, but I'm sure it's very in line with other states. That is twice that of our general population. But in contrast, 35% of self-made millionaires and entrepreneurs are dyslexic versus an average of 10% of the average population who are self-made millionaires and entrepreneurs. So I have to ask you, how many CEOs are dyslexic and sitting in a prison cell? Why is the number of people with dyslexia in jail so high? Because we fail them in kindergarten, first and second grade, when we don't identify them as dyslexic or teach them to read in a way that they can read to learn. And then because they don't want to be made fun of or seen as failures, then they act out. They become the class clown. They try to fly under the radar. And for those of them that act out, especially if they're little black or brown kids, they're labeled as troublemakers and start down that school to prison pipeline. There are ways to help dyslexic people who are in jail and reduce the recidivism rate. There's a study in England that describes a simple and inexpensive program involving literate prisoners helping dyslexic prisoners learn to read, which has led to remarkable results. There's no reason to think that similar programs couldn't work in our jails and homeless shelters in the US. Here's my last thought to leave you with. What if we did some reallocation as to where we put our funds over a 10-year period, from prisons to education? I really would love to see the results of that study. So Frederick Douglass said it best: it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So let's end with this. If we can set them up right, they have infinite potential. A kid with dyslexia did all those things. If we can foster literacy, confidence in these kids, they have infinite potential. And I should have added to this list, won the Nobel Prize. Let's all be the voice for these kids so that they can take this route versus the more common and bleak one. Right? Which road are we taking? So it was your choice to attend this session today, and know and understand that all is what that doesn't make any sense what I was going to say. I'm so sorry. You took it upon you to see this session today and to understand what's going on. Knowledge is power, right? Each one of you is a powerful ally to our community. And if we all drop one bean in that pot before we know it, together we've made bean soup. All right. Thank you guys so much for attending this session. If you want to see any of the other 4 parts of this 5W series on dyslexia and advocacy and intervention for kids, please go to dyslexiaondemand.com. And I just really appreciate your dedication to all of this. Thanks, guys.